Welcome to Food for Thought, a discussion on the impact of food insecurity on children's education. This program is presented in partnership with the Boeing Company, Communities and Schools, and the San Antonio Chamber of Commerce. My name is Katie Ferrier, and I'm Vice President of Education and Workforce Development at the Chamber. So happy many of you were able to join us today. Before we get started with the program, I'd like to remind you this is a live event, but we are recording and it will be available on the San Antonio Chamber YouTube channel. Now, I'm proud to introduce today's moderator, Tyler Schroeder from the Boeing Company.
Well, thank you, Katie. Welcome all of you from wherever you are. Thank you for tuning in today to learn more about a systemic problem in our community, one that threatens the progress of our community and our economy, and that is food insecurity. I am Tyler Schroeder, Senior Manager of State and Local Government Operations for Boeing, and I am pleased to moderate today what I anticipate will be an insightful and thought-provoking discussion. My sincere hope is that each of us here today leaves with a fresh respect of the impacts of food insecurity and a renewed sense of urgency in collaborating on a solution. Food insecurity is defined as a disruption to food intake or eating patterns due to lack of money, access, or other resources. Food insecurity does not necessarily cause hunger, but families in crisis are at high risk for that very outcome. The pandemic certainly amplified the challenges, as we all saw, and pushed this issue really into public consciousness. But make no mistake, this has long been a concern for our community in San Antonio and the region. The impact of food insecurity and hunger on our children is very real and requires a multi-pronged solution. Child hunger is a health problem. Child hunger is an educational problem. And child hunger is a workforce and job readiness problem. Human capital is the key to our strong and successful economy, and the harmful effects of food insecurity and hunger can devastate the potential of our human capital to flourish. Research has shown that workers who experience hunger as children create a workforce that is less competitive, lower levels of educational and technical skills, and is seriously constrained. We at Boeing see this as a problem requiring a community-wide solution, as it certainly is a community-wide problem. We want to start a collaborative dialogue to address this crisis. The solution absolutely cannot be found in one entity or one sector. And today, I hope that we can begin to see a path forward in our conversation and a collection of individuals who want to make a difference for our neighbors' most vulnerable members. To help us dissect this problem, I am extremely excited to introduce you to our panelists, all of whom are making a difference in their own right in this space. We're joined today by three very distinguished individuals: the Honorable U.S. Congressman Joaquin Castro, who represents Texas's 20th Congressional District, encompassing most of San Antonio; Dr. Michael Villarreal, the Director of UTSA's Urban Education Institute, who has extensive research on this issue; and Jessica Weaver, the Chief Executive Officer for Communities and Schools San Antonio, who is consistently combating this issue on the front lines in our public education system. I'll introduce each panelist and have them answer a question from their respective lenses. And so to start today, I'd really love to kick it off with Dr. Michael Villarreal. Dr. Villarreal is the founding director of the Urban Education Institute at the University of Texas at San Antonio after serving 15 years in the Texas House of Representatives. His research focuses on evaluating policies, programs, and structures that affect educational achievement. His research pays special interest in the topics of early education, college and career readiness, and the education of students from marginalized communities. In leading the Urban Education Institute, Dr. Villarreal is attempting to combine rigorous scientific research, engaging storytelling, and community building to help educators and concerned citizens raise educational achievement and economic mobility in the greater San Antonio region. And as luck would have it, Dr. Villarreal has made food insecurity a topic of his phenomenal research recently. Mike, clearly food insecurity is a problem in multiple places across the United States. But what did your research find was unique or particularly challenging about the situation here locally and regionally in the San Antonio area?
Thank you for the question. Well, what we found unique about San Antonio's food insecurity problem is that it was present everywhere across our city, but is particularly concentrated in certain neighborhoods of our city. Overall, we've discovered that about a quarter of all of Bexar County was experiencing some level of food insecurity among families with school-age children during this time. And I do have some slides that I think are available. Could we go ahead and show the first slide? While that gets going, I will just say that that number is about 26% of students and parents who we interviewed during the pandemic. This is the summer of 2020. 26% said they were experiencing food insecurity. Specifically, we asked them, did you ever run out of food and you didn't have money to go out and buy more? 26% answered in the affirmative on that. And why should we care about that? Well, think about yourself. How do you feel when you're really hungry? Are you your best self? I'll speak for myself. My blood sugar drops. I get really impatient. I can't concentrate. If you talk to my wife, she will say I am not my best self. I'm quite moody and grumpy. Well, imagine experiencing that day in and day out as a child. What we see is that it's going to impact their education. And that's what we discovered. If you turn to the next slide. First, even though the overall number was 26%, we discovered that rates of food insecurity were much higher in certain neighborhoods. Edgewood, almost half of everybody we interviewed said that they were experiencing food insecurity. That number drops down as you move northward, with Northeast being at the lowest level of 19%. CAST is a network of high schools that are in a number of school districts, so they're not geographically specific, bounded to one part of the city. The general pattern was that greater food insecurity was found within Loop 410 on the west side and south sides of San Antonio. Next slide, please. So we interviewed parents and teenagers in high school. When we focused on the teenagers, when we were interviewing them, we discovered 20% of this population experience food insecurity. However, the food insecure high school students were disproportionately represented. They're overrepresented in the group of students who said that they were never experiencing engagement in their classroom lessons at the rate of 25%. And then next slide, please. When we then asked them about homework assignments, boy, that number really shot up. They were overrepresented at the level of 65% of those who said they never turned in their homework. And so clearly, for the kids who were experiencing food insecurity, that was highly predictive of them being less engaged in the classroom and less engaged in completing homework assignments. Next slide, please. Food insecurity is really one symptom of a larger set of circumstances that describe the social and economic circumstances of our families. And what we discovered during the pandemic, which certainly spiked food insecurity, was that there are a lot of things being lost. Fundamentally, our families, many of them, approximately 48%, experienced a hit to their household income, either losing jobs, losing hours of work, or some other kind of income that was helping them stay afloat. Next slide, please. And that meant that kids often had to step in and be caregivers, or even try to find work or increase their hours in the jobs that they previously held. Now, many teenagers did lose their jobs during this time, but many others ended up actually increasing their hours in order to help their families. We saw that caregiving went up during the pandemic across all school systems that were included in our survey. We had 59% participating in caregiving responsibilities, but we also found that, 59% of those who were involved in caregiving said it really impacted their studies. And so a whole cascade of issues are really raining down on our kids. In addition to food insecurity, having to step up and help younger siblings was also a part of their story, and that impacted their ability to keep up with their school. As we see here, for certain school districts that was high, but really across the board, these numbers are very high, ranging from 43% to 66%, saying, yeah, caregiving really is interfering with my ability to keep up with school. Next slide, please. This graph describes the percent of older high school students who said their employment made it harder to keep up with work. So thinking about the context, families losing their jobs, kids needing to step up and increase their work where they can, ultimately, that too impacts their ability to keep up with their learning, ranging from 50 to 100% are saying, my workload now is making it is really harming my ability to be a student. Thank you. I think that's the end of the slides. In summary, this issue of food insecurity is important. It really gets at a more fundamental issue of poverty in San Antonio, and how it is harming the greatest investment that we're trying to make as a society, and that is an investment in our children's future. And so to the extent that they are unable to be at full capacity in the classroom, it's going to diminish their prospects in the future to be our leaders in industry and government and in all the other domains that we really need them to become leaders in. Thank you.
Dr. Villarreal, thank you for that, and thank you for your research. I think it's impactful, nothing that we want to hear, but it is the unbridled truth, and we really appreciate all that you do in that space. I want to shift over, if I may, to Jessica Weaver. Jessica Weaver is here in her role as CEO of Communities and Schools of San Antonio. As Chief Executive Officer, Jessica plays an active role in managing the daily operations and strategic direction of that agency. Certainly always on the move, Jessica collaborates with school districts, community partners, and agency staff to ensure that Communities and Schools meets its objectives and continues to provide a high quality of service to students and schools. Jessica joined the Communities and Schools San Antonio team in 1989 as a case manager at Wren Middle School after graduating from the UT Austin School of Social Work. Constantly inspired by the mission of Communities and Schools, Jessica has dedicated now over 25 years to helping kids overcome obstacles to obtain an education. Jessica, thank you so much for being here. You clearly have a passion about this. I'd like to focus on the impact that Dr. Villarreal just mentioned on our students. It's a clear impact to our students, and that makes this an economic development issue, doesn't it? To help us understand what food insecurity means for our students in our school system, help us understand that piece and what Communities and Schools is doing to help the situation.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me here to talk about really our kids and talking about how our community can come together to really support our kids. So I think that Dr. Villarreal's information really highlighted kind of what we see, and most of all helps us to start thinking about why it's important to notice and to take care of. And I think I'm going to start, first of all, with sometimes I think when we talk about food insecurity, there could be a bias around thinking about maybe families who just aren't trying hard, that there's, opportunities in and out there. But often what we see is our families, very much what Dr. Villarreal talked about, is that they're working really hard. We have a parent, maybe a single parent home, and they're living paycheck to paycheck. So from an economic standpoint and in a job, in our workforce development issues right now, it's around families being able to earn an income that can support the needs of a family. And so it's often where our family hits a crisis or hours are dropped or something of that nature. And I'll talk about a family in particular, a single mom who was raising 3 kids and also and all of a sudden needed to take care of their mom and was trying to manage and navigate through all those situations. And really what hit was a need to support their kids around those basic needs. And food was one of those first things that got hit around their being able to fund those and support those. And so when our kids feel that insecurity as a symptom, that's just a small symptom of what they see, they're in this crisis mode. They're kind of in this survival mode. What is the next thing? And so it's not unrealistic to see the numbers that Dr. Villarreal talked about around how am I thinking about my homework when I'm just trying to really figure out how we're getting food on the table? How do I stay engaged in my classroom? But when you're also in that survival mode, you're not really thinking about the future. You're thinking about that day-to-day need and what we need to do. And so if we lose that opportunity to have our kids thinking in the future and how this can help, then we're losing some gain on what they can successfully do every day in their academic success. And so our kids feel that. They may not understand the dynamics of what it costs maybe to go, maybe our high school students do, or the cost or how it was impacted their family, but they feel that because it's something that's missing in their everyday life. And we also know that our families who are dealing with food insecurity is just going to be one thing, right? That's not, there's probably other insecurities that are affecting the family at that time as well. And so managing to keep a food over our head. And so these are important things. And I think that food insecurity is a real symptom that can be flagged to say, okay, we know that this is affecting this family, and how do we intervene and how do we come together to address this, knowing that it could potentially affect them for the long term. And so it definitely, I think all the stats that Dr. Villarreal mentioned there is things that we see. And I think teachers have done a great job of recognizing, what's happening, all of a sudden you're not turning in work. What's happening? What can we do? And asking that question, not why are you not doing this, but what is happening to support our kids in that effort? And so we see it every day, but we also see that schools, where we have our site coordinators, schools are a great venue and where families can figure out, okay, how can I get support during this time? What can I do to get our family in a situation where my kids aren't worried about food on an everyday basis that affect their educational process in the way, as we go through the days of school. So we definitely see that. And I see that the numbers are really real and they're real faces. They're real families that are really struggling through that every single day. I'll give you one more example. I think about the effects of COVID as well, that we want, I just always want to make sure we have a face to that. We had a family who everyone that was an adult in that family was working really hard. They all had a job, and the effects of COVID, they all lost their job at the same time. They were already in a very vulnerable position. And the last thing probably in their head at that moment was homework. The last thing was not that it doesn't matter, but when you've all lost your job during this time frame, what are you looking at the priorities? And so you can see the effects that would take on our kids when you're trying to still maintain some kind of standard of going into your school or doing your homework or virtual homework, whatever it was at that time. And so I wanted to make sure that we understood the families that are facing this. It's about families who are working hard and doing everything that they can to support their families. But this is a real issue that they face.
Jessica, that's such a great point. There's so many distractions, and it's hard to find one that is more distracting than hunger. There's a great candy bar commercial out there, right? That says you're not you when you're hungry, and that's totally true. How can we expect these students and these families to focus on a career, to focus on education when all they're really concerned about is where their next meal is coming from? Jessica, thank you so much. I am told now that we are we have our distinguished guest here in Congressman Joaquin Castro, and I want to introduce him. Congressman, thank you so much for joining. I know you are a very busy man, and you've got limited time with us, but I'm so thrilled that you're able to join us today. A quick intro, we all know the Congressman. He was elected to U.S. Congress to represent Texas's 20th district in 2012 after serving 5 terms in the Texas House. 4th term in the U.S. House, I believe, right now. Castro serves on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, as well as the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the House Education and Labor Committee. Congressman, you have clearly been a very long champion of education in this country, of education in the San Antonio region. Perhaps you could tell us a bit more about the legislation that you authored this year, the Feeding Hungry Students in Schools Act, and please characterize why food insecurity is such a focus of yours, and it should be for the rest of us as well. And thank you so much for being here.
Sure. No, thank you, Tyler. And thank you to the Chamber for convening all of us and Boeing and everybody else who helped put this on. And also to be on here with Mike Villarreal, who I served with the whole time that I was in the legislature for 10 years, and all the other panelists, and thank them for their great work. Today wasn't supposed to be especially busy, but the speaker and the president are pressing to take a vote on infrastructure today, the big infrastructure bill. And so things got very hurried and very busy very quickly. So I apologize that I'm a few minutes late. But this is an incredibly important topic for San Antonio, because our city is still one of the cities among major American towns that is one of the poorest and one of the most economically segregated. And you have people that are dealing with hunger and with food insecurity. And I grew up on the deep west side of San Antonio. My family and I moved around about 4 different times when I was growing up. And there were times in my family where both my parents were together until I was 8, were out of work. And once in a while, I would see a church van that would pull up to our house and drop off food for us because my parents were having trouble affording food. And that's the story for so many families in San Antonio today, and it has been for generations. And so it's an issue that I'm glad that the Chamber is taking on and is highlighting today. In terms of what's been done, most recently during the pandemic, there's been about $39 billion. But if you look at all of the coronavirus legislation that's come over the last year and a half or so, about $39 billion to combat food insecurity and hunger. And as you all know, the San Antonio Food Bank over the years, but particularly during the pandemic, has done an incredible job in serving the San Antonio community and the regional community. I think the nation was shocked by that photo. You remember that photo of cars that snaked towards the front of the line in that first event that was organized by the food bank shortly after the pandemic started. And so we continue to have a deep, deep challenge with food insecurity. And one of the pieces of legislation that I'm working on, that I filed, is the Feeding Hungry Students in Schools Act. And it's actually modeled off of a piece of legislation that Diego Bernal passed in the Texas legislature in 2017, which is to be able to take foods and our schools and turn them into food pantries. And most especially by allowing them, giving them power statutorily, in his case in Texas, in my piece of legislation across the country, to allow them to basically give away unused food, but then also serve additionally as food pantries for communities. And so if we can achieve that, it would be an incredibly powerful tool for us to feed hungry families and hungry students and others, parents, through our schools. And so I'm working on that. I'm pushing that legislation very hard. I'm hoping to gain more support in the House and in the Senate for us to be able to do that. Because as I mentioned, in San Antonio, this is a very, very deep problem for us and continues to be. So I just want to join you all today to say thank you for all of your work. I know, for example, that Mike's been working on it for a long time. including during the time that he was in the legislature. Worked with community schools on these issues before. And so thank you very much and best of luck on all of it.
Well, Congressman, thank you. Thank you for your leadership. It's going to take that. There's certainly a collaborative effort here. It is so fantastic to see solutions coming out of Texas because that is where this is a very real problem. You mentioned the great representative here in San Antonio, Diego Bernal, leading on this effort as well. It's so fantastic to see different levels of government acting in collaboration on that as well. And my understanding is your co-author, your co-sponsor of the federal bill as well is another Texas representative. And so it's great to see the Texas leadership. I know you have a hard stop. You've got great other great things to do today as well. We appreciate your leadership on this topic and would love to stay engaged with you. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you. And the last point I would make is you're right, Tyler, that it's a bipartisan bill. Van Taylor, a Republican from Plano, a very conservative Republican, is my co-author on it. And so it's an issue that we should be able to tackle together.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Well, this chamber stands ready. We stand ready. And hopefully this is the start of more and more collaboration because this is such a systemic problem, but a community-wide problem as well. So again, we thank you for your leadership and thank you for joining today. Jessica, I would like to go back to you after we heard from the congressman. It's interesting because a lot of the things that he's talking about seem just so logical on why we should have policy around this effort. I know that Communities in Schools has done very similar work and is currently doing very similar work to what he outlined as far as pantries in schools. I was hoping you might be able to give us a sense, and I know you have some slides here, and we'll pull those up, Andrew, if we can. I'd love to get your take on what Communities in Schools is doing actively right now to help address this.
Well, one thing that we really serve a role in is being that connector for families around resources that families need or accessing those resources. So sometimes we may think that resources are available, but it's really difficult to navigate the system. So that's one thing that we really try to serve as that navigation tool for our families to connect to those resources or to apply for some of those resources that they would actually benefit from, and then connect to those resources that are available within their community. So that's one thing. I'm showing y'all some pictures of the, during COVID, what we found was, it's very similar to the data that Dr. Villarreal showed, is what we found was there was a lot of information around food availability through different, you saw lines of cars, but what we found were families that were already in a vulnerable situation, they couldn't access those resources. And so we had to find ways to make sure that we were going outside of that school and getting those resources to our families that we knew could not access some of those systems. So that's one of the things that's really important, is really being that access point. Where can I get that? How can I be supported? And then how can we find long-term solutions for your family around this issue by accessing some of the support services that are out there in the community? And then in the schools, I think COVID, there's a lot of bad things about COVID, but what COVID really showed us was that schools are the center of our families, right? They are the center of so many things that our families count on, and food was one of those. And so what we do is we embed ourselves into a school campus, because that is where we see our kids on an everyday basis. We see their situation on an everyday basis. Teachers recognize that our kids may be struggling with things. And so we provide that support to teachers so that teachers are not trying to figure out how to navigate all of their needs, so that we can navigate some of those needs. So we loved the bill that Representative Bernal had in place, because it's a way to not waste food, and it's a way to have food very readily available in the schools, and having those available to the school, to the students right then and there are great. We also work with a lot of entities to create mobile food pantries. And it was interesting watching the shift, a role that we played from a mobile food pantry, that's something we've always done, and how schools have really taken a big step in moving in that direction, recognizing that there are still some gaps that our families are facing, and we want our kids to be the best that they can, with food being taken care of on an everyday basis. So we're always navigating, trying to make sure that we're covering those gaps and partnering with other agencies to make sure that we can bring some of those food resources into our campus. And then the other thing is really just, the main thing is really helping identify kids who are really struggling with that, because they can have resources available, but if we're not identifying them and we're not using the system that we have in place, which is our school system, they could easily be missed. And it's a great, it's creating just a safe environment for families to be able to come in and talk about what's really happening, and being able to not be judged and not be questioned about what is going on, but rather than be supported and walk them through that process of how to get to a better place when it comes to that food insecurity. So we feel like we want to play that role. We feel like we serve that role on a campus, really supporting families and navigating, but also being a support system to help our kiddos not feel that insecurity of the physical insecurity of food, but also just the emotional response that our kids have, and feeling stressed because not wanting to be a burden to their families either as well. So those are the things that we feel are really important in creating that atmosphere at our schools to support our families.
Thanks, Jessica. And certainly a differentiator, I think, with the way that communities and schools is tackling this issue, among others, is the fact that you're physically in the schools. And that's a touch point that other organizations don't have. And it is so important. And you bring up a great point, and I want to bring Dr. Villarreal back into the conversation here and keep you both on camera if I can, just so we can go back and forth on this. But Mike, your research told us about the impact of the pandemic on multiple aspects of the educational experience. Jessica just brought up this kind of mental health, mental well-being. I would imagine emotional recovery over a crisis like that, a crisis of not knowing where your next meal is going to come from. That's the long pole in the tent. No, I mean that could last years. That could stick with you. Could you elaborate on what the short-term and long-term implications of these challenges are on students and on the educational system, in particular, maybe the lack of physical access to the food?
Yes, I couldn't agree more, right? There are going to be lingering impacts. Even if today a family has overcome their food insecurity challenges, their experience from the prior year of having food insecurity is going to have created some emotional scars that need healing, and it's going to take time. Trauma is something that just doesn't go away overnight. It is something that you have to overcome over time, and with the intention of caring adults and others in your community. This is a multi-layered problem. I want to be the first to recognize that our schools are so important, that they are where so many of our children find safety, find caring, loving adults, and I want to underline that there are these caring, loving adults who have also been harmed during the pandemic. Our teachers are suffering incredible levels of burnout. And so when I think about the long-term impacts of the pandemic, today we have a teacher shortage. In the school district my kids attend, which is San Antonio ISD, there's about 150 teacher vacancies that they are unable to fill. They also are short subs. And so what this means is that those responsibilities don't go away. Other teachers in the school community are having to take up the responsibilities of the absent teachers, which only increases their burnout. And so we're having to really rebuild. We're still, coming out of the pandemic, but we really have to shift to gears to thinking about how do we rebuild? How do we help our kids overcome the trauma they experience? And oh, by the way, how do we also help our teachers overcome the experience they've just went through and that they're still going through? We can see this is going to take time, because if you look at the students who got degrees in order to get certified to teach, that for UTSA, half of the teachers who were supposed to get certified actually got certified. So our level of students who graduated and then became certified dropped in half. So this isn't unique to San Antonio. This is a national crisis. But what is unique to San Antonio is that we have this really deep love for our community. And I think we're going to be able to come together as a community and develop solutions at every level, not just what needs to be going on at the school level, but also the school district level. And then as a greater San Antonio community, how can we pull together the resources of our local governments and our nonprofits to address this teacher shortage problem and the other challenges that our students face?
Tyler,
Yes,
when it comes to
go ahead,
bringing
please.
people together and we're talking about food insecurity, I think it's a next step is actually bringing people together to help navigate systems easier. And I think the burden that teachers have in seeing their kids hungry is not just a burden of how do I teach them past this hunger, but they see the hunger. And so, but how do we navigate all the resources that do exist and make them much more easily accessible to our families so that teachers aren't trying to navigate that. Everyone's not trying to navigate it. So I think there's a great next step around talking about how do we bring all these institutions together? How do we bring everyone? Because typically what we find, if a family comes in, your typical resources are going to be the church nearby and the school nearby. And so, but they all have a network, right? The church then has a network, and then the school has a network. And so how do we bring those together with the community that we know really wants and cares about our kids, right? Wants to do best for kids. How do we bring it together and create a less difficult system to navigate through that? And I think that's what we can all, one of those things that we can do together, and focusing on food insecurity, right? Sometimes we think that that's not a topic for me because I don't provide food, but I think we all provide some systems that can support, whether it's the local church, whether it's the school, whether it's, bringing people together. I think that goes into the food insecurity, not, teacher shortage is one thing, but I do think that there are things that we can do to help make things easier to access resources. And that's probably the most difficult part for our families sometimes is, how do I get that help? Where do I start?
Yeah, such a great point. We have to be able to inform people where to turn, and that there are solutions out there, or at least Band-Aids at the time. I want to pull on a thread here, in that this is you both hit on it. San Antonio, what is totally unique about San Antonio is the way we tend to rally around an issue as a community. And I think this has to be a community investment, regardless, Dr. Villarreal, which part of the city that this is, that, you go through the stats and where it's worse and where it's less. But I will say this, why it needs to be a community investment. your data that you presented earlier showed that Northeast ISD is the lowest at 19%. That's still 1 in 5 families. That's the lowest. That should be and is an unacceptable rate. And so it's not only that we should focus on the areas that are worse, but the community as a whole is grappling with this issue, and it takes, I think, a community response. So my question to both of you, and Mike, I'd love to start with you and then kick it over to Jessica, is we as a community have a long history of rallying around an issue. We've done this with education, we've done this with workforce, proven here recently with the Ready to Work, SA Ready to Work program, right? So do you start to see an ecosystem building around this problem, food insecurity? Do we understand it? Do we see an ecosystem building, or is there more to be done? Mike, I'll start with you.
I think that we do have an ecosystem. We just need to be much more intentional about how we work together to address this problem. And I think that is one thing that's going to come out of the pandemic. Is it's been an incredible stress test of our current systems, and we discovered where we have shortfalls, and we've discovered new strategies of how to reach families. We've also discovered policies that just don't make sense. Like, for example, in the state of Texas, we've set the bar so low on who qualifies for food stamps. If you have a car that is of a certain value, you can't have access to food supports. That's ridiculous. Like, there's no need to set it that low. We discovered a lot of suburban families who depend on a car to get to work lost their jobs or were furloughed during this time, and they couldn't get access to food, so they were showing up at the food bank. We need to have policies that recognize that the best place to help families get food is at HEB or some other grocery store, not in a parking lot. And so I think we have great partners in our ecosystem, but you're right. We need to take some time to really map out the processes of how we get food to the table, and what we can change that's in our control should be agenda number 1. But agenda number 2 should be, what are the policies and rules that we need to change in the state legislature so that we do the caregiving that we can more effectively locally.
Yeah.
Well, and Mike, you're absolutely an expert on that, no doubt. Jessica, same question. Communities and Schools is already traditionally a collaborator. I would point out the Smart City Challenge in partnership with the Mayor's Office and SAMSAT this past year. This was the topic, food insecurity. So maybe talk a little bit about that and what you think more can be done for all of us in the audience today.
Yeah, I will say that one example around during COVID, what I found interesting is there were some regulations that were kind of taken off the table, and that food was just then allowed to be given to families that needed it through the school districts. And it was great that schools weren't having to technically record why you needed food or that you had to qualify for needing food. And it would be great to be able to go back to some of those policies that were kind of taken away, and how can those be a benefit to our families as a whole. So I just wanted to support Dr. Villarreal in that process, because we saw some of those being kind of taken away during a crisis, but how can we take some of those away during a normal time where we know that people are still do not have the resources that they need? But yes, so collaborating and doing that. So I really find it interesting because people would probably think about Tyler, like you're representing Boeing, and why are you talking about food, right? So you're just a perfect example already of going into an issue that, maybe isn't your everyday conversation in what you do, and so many people don't understand kind of how they fit into that role. And the Mayor City Challenge, in our collaboration with SAMSAT, really, we brought the issue to kids. We asked them, what are some things, and some of the ideas that they came up with: more community gardens, more just food available there, more mobile, more access points to food. I think that's one of the things. East Central was in one of those slides that Dr. Villarreal mentioned. And I remember during COVID, our staff were like stopping at gas stations trying to find food, milk for a family, things like that. And so access points, understanding access points, and addressing that. That's what our kids recognize, right? That we needed more access points to food. And so I think there's a place for everyone to have a conversation around how they can support the community around this area. And it may not be that you're in the schools providing that direct support, but it may be that you have an infrastructure of thoughts or things that we can be thinking about to address this need. And so I think, Tyler, it's the perfect example, is like, why is Boeing talking about food? But you're thinking about the future, right? You're thinking about the impact that this has on our kids. And if our kids are in survival mode every day and not thinking about their future, then their future is going to be as limited to that crisis rather than to the full potential that they have to give to this community. And we don't want that to be the case for our kids, because poverty is not going to define our kids, right? As a community, we need to decide that food insecurity, those things are not going to define our kids. We want their full potential to be given back to this community. There's also other ways. I think about people think about, I have to give food to help. Thinking about our kids' future, many companies can offer internships. Get our kids to be thinking about new things that maybe they haven't had the opportunity to think about, because maybe in their everyday life, maybe things are just day to day, right? We talked about our high school kids who are caretakers, right? What are the skills they're learning by being caretakers? There's a lot of responsibility that they are learning to be those caretakers. How do we use those skills in ways and award them for those skills, providing internships, providing mentoring opportunities, help them to see broader as we work through some of their life, struggles, and that come to the table and come into the school. So there are so many ways that our ecosystem can support our kids. And it's not just by giving food, it's also helping them to be exposed and have opportunities to think beyond whatever crisis they face today. And so I just think there's a place for everyone.
Well, much of what you said should be permanently placed on a billboard on major interstates in the state. And I'm going to use it as a prompt to encourage those on the line to invest in this problem as well. We at Boeing realized the end goal of everybody is the same, and that is gainful employment, transformational progress in generational families because of a good career. And the path to get you there, which we have focused on for quite some time, now has a threat to it, and it is food insecurity. And we've talked about that today. The reason that we have decided we can be a leader on it is because we've realized that we aren't required to be the expert. And you guys are the experts. Jessica, you're the expert. Dr. Villarreal, you're the expert. We can leverage and amplify the work that you guys are doing. And as we discussed, it takes a community, it takes a village to really tackle this issue and the root causes to it. I'm also going to use it as a prompt to introduce one more individual with us here today. And I'm very eager to introduce a special guest, Mr. Mike Lawson, who is the Senior Manager of Boeing Global Engagement, a great colleague of mine here in Texas. Mike oversees Boeing's vast charitable giving portfolio in the state of Texas, and I believe he has a very exciting announcement for us today. So Mike, over to you.
Yes, Tyler, thank you. Are you able to hear me?
Loud and clear.
Loud and clear. Okay, so thank you, and thank you for everyone on this panel for all of these passionate and necessary remarks about a topic that is so important to address. Like Tyler said, my name is Mike Lawson, and I support all of our sites here in Texas. Like everyone has said, this is an issue that impacts every part of our society, especially here in San Antonio. Without thoughtful people putting time and effort into thinking critically about food insecurity, we can't expect for outcomes to change. That is why Boeing is so honored to be a part of this conversation, and why we also want to be a part of the solution to help curb these harmful effects of food insecurity. $100,000 in communities and schools, and they're directly towards helping CIS expand their food program by providing support for their pop-up food pantries, weekend meal kits, district-based food pantries, and more. It's our hope that with this investment, CIS and Boeing will help address food insecurity in more than 100 schools and reach over 3,500 students. So thank you, CIS, for all the thanks for all the people who are here who are putting significant time and effort into combating this issue, and I'll thank Tyler and the team for helping get this over the threshold. So I got a cool check right here virtually. We've got the ability to have a big party, but I just want to say thanks for everyone involved. This is going to be a great partnership going forward.
Thanks. Thank you, Michael. It's you were going in and out. I'm part of it, but we all got the main part of it is being part of the solution and part of the gift of the solution. And so we absolutely appreciate it. I will say that we also heard those last parts in helping schools with their food pantries, having those pop-up food pantries, and just being available for kids when they need it the most. I think takes a lot of stress off of all the adults who are trying to take care of our kids, and you're really being part of that solution is such a great support to us. That the need has grown, and we just our staff, honestly, when we tell them, they're going to be so excited because they love having the opportunity to navigate that food insecurity with their kids in an easy way and not put pressure on our families. So I just want to say thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And I hope to give you some smiling faces pictures so that you can see just the impact that you've made on our that you'll make on our families.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks, Jessica. We've also got a broadband issue in the state, but we'll save that topic for another conversation. But Mike, thank you for helping us in today on a high note. $100,000 investment from Boeing to communities and schools. This is just a start. We want to be part of the solution going forward. We want to collaborate. We want to bring awareness to this issue. We are so thrilled to invest in your success, Jessica, and Communities and Schools San Antonio on behalf of this community. With that, I want to thank the San Antonio Chamber of Commerce for hosting and investing leadership in this discussion today. To each of our panelists, thank you. Mike, thank you so much for being with us to share the data you've compiled, for your leadership on this, and for giving us the truth and the perspective that we all need to see to create a solution around. Thank you so much for being with us today. Jessica, thank you for providing a shining example of how an organization can have such a direct impact on our students suffering from this. So thank you both for being here today. We thank the congressman. He had to drop off for other work, but we thank him for being here in his leadership on our behalf up at the Capitol in Washington, D.C. And to our audience today, thank you for your interest in the well-being of our most valuable asset, our students. Boeing will continue to prioritize every aspect of educating our youth, and that includes helping ensure that education is their focus and not hunger. Food insecurity stifles educational attainment, limiting a child's future development and their family's future progress, and the economic health of our community as a whole and the businesses that aim to succeed within it. It is our sincere hope that today provided a positive glimpse into what is being done to address the issue, but more so served as a call to action for each of us to act collaboratively to address this issue. On behalf of the San Antonio Chamber, we wish you all a good afternoon and good health. Thank you all for being here, and thank you to our panelists one more time. Thank you all.